Okay, just about ready to go. Okay.
Alrighty, we'll wait a couple minutes because it's 9:13 and people always wondering, they gotta go get their coffee first, all that. Make sure you have one of the handouts. If you're watching online and you want a copy of what I say, as you know, I always have a handout. Just email me, I will send you the copy of what we use today. So this kind of class piggybacks a bit on American Midnight. American Midnight doesn't go into all these things, but some of the same issues with racial tensions and everything else leads to this as kind of the natural flow time period. Now we're entering into the 1930s, but it's what was happening prior to the 1930s that kind of leads. History, society is always built on each other. Nothing happens in a vacuum. So today class is based on the book of Hitler's American Model by James Whitman. He's a Yale professor, but we're really focused on this idea from Jim Crow to Nuremberg, the global legacy of American race law. So anyone ever read Hitler's American Model or any books in a similar vein? So this might be new information. It's one of those things that even Whitman kind of says people kind of thought about it, but hadn't done a lot of actual research. So he went in and really kind of looked at old transcripts of meetings of Nazis and notes to kind of see, yes, they are making specific references to the U.S. So it's one of those people kind of thought about it, maybe it made sense, but no one really went all the way. But it's also something that Americans haven't highlighted, because we don't like to highlight the shadow sides of our history. We try to sweep a lot of it under the rug, especially when it affects global stuff. And the Germans also didn't really highlight it. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but they, at least today, most Germans now, very much wanting to take the blame for the Holocaust themselves and never have an inkling that, hey, it's somebody else's fault, we're passing the buck. They want to take kind of the, almost like we did this ourselves. We let this happen. So they don't really advertise, well, we learned it from this, that, and the other group, because that could seem like passing the buck, and they don't want to do that. We kind of talked about that a little bit in August with learning from the Germans, how they go through this process of working off their history, working it out, owning it, and learning from it. So for today's class, we're looking at the influence of American race law, particularly the Jim Crow laws, on Nazi Germany's legal codification of racial hierarchy, most notably in the form of the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. So we're kind of center ourselves around 1935 and the years prior. So we're going to focus on this book, Hitler's American Model. So this whole idea, this story isn't about laying blame for the Holocaust on the United States. The Nazi regime was fully capable of generating its own ideology of hatred and violence. But this is a story about influence, about precedent, and about the disturbing global legacy of American white supremacy, which still is alive and well today. So it's not about assigning guilt by association. It's about understanding how legal systems rooted in racism can cross borders and inspire atrocities elsewhere. By examining the ways American race law influenced the Third Reich, we can better grasp both the global legacy of white supremacy and the profound responsibilities of legal institutions in shaping society. And just so you know, it's not just Nazi Germany that used these laws. Other places around the world were inspired, learned from American race laws to establish their own racial hierarchies, their own apartheids, their own segregations. So let's start, kind of set the scene and the symbol here. Let's begin in New York Harbor. Make sure you grab a sheet there in my packet. Let's start in New York Harbor, 1935. A group of anti-Nazi activists board the German ocean liner, the SS Bremen, tore down its swastika flags, ripping them up and tossing them into the harbor. This protest made international headlines. Hitler demanded the United States prosecute the demonstrators. So we have a long history of protests in this country with things that matter. U.S. officials refused. Technically, they said, the swastika wasn't yet Germany's official flag. So it's not like they're tearing up an Italian flag, national flag or something. A few months later, though, in direct response, Hitler declared that the swastika would now be the official flag of Nazi Germany, a move accompanied by the rollout of the Nuremberg Laws. So, an act that happens here in the U.S. has a direct link to the swastika becoming the official flag of Nazi Germany. Unintended consequences, right? So it's a chilling moment where this symbolic confrontation in the U.S. helped catalyze illegal architecture of persecution in Germany. And that's where we often don't know how our actions are going to affect these. We can think we're doing something good, we're protesting, we're showing this is bad. Sometimes that can lead to worse things. This summer, I'm going to Germany and we'll learn a lot of stuff going to Prague. One of the things I'm going to be studying is something called Operation Anthropoid, which was kind of a operation by the resistance in Prague to take out the main Nazi leader in Prague. And I'm going to write about, was it a right choice or not? It's hard to say because, yeah, they were successful, but then it ultimately led to some pretty tough reprisals back on innocent people. So when is resistance good? It can help, keep people in the fight, but also it can have negative consequences. Every action we do. So these protests had these consequences in Germany that led more to the Nuremberg Laws, led to the swastika becoming the official flag. And that's not the only thing, but it helped motivate that. So, let's look at Hitler's racial ideology and the American influence. So it brings up to the kind of the core question of today's class. How did American race law influence Nazi Germany? So now we're going to go back to 1923. After the failed beer hall push, Adolf Hitler was imprisoned and began writing Mein Kampf. In it, he praised the United States not as a political ally, but as a racial model. He wrote admiringly of America's conquest of the continent and its success in maintaining racial purity, particularly through restrictive immigration laws. So, when we think about immigration laws today, it's a hot button topic. It's always been a hot button topic. A lot of race laws in the U.S. actually come from immigration laws, even against other Europeans. So, immigration stuff's nothing new. Racial issues, nothing new. It really starts back with immigration laws and even like the Irish. So, Hitler kind of appreciated America's immigration laws and their kind of racial laws. He writes, quote, "The racially pure and still unmixed German has risen to become master of the American continent, and he will remain the master as long as he does not fall victim to racial pollution." So what specifically impressed Hitler was the U.S. Immigration Act of 1924. This law sharply limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and almost completely excluded non-Europeans. Hitler viewed as a pioneering example of racial policy aligned with the goals of the Nazi program of 1920. Hitler's praise was not offhand. It was part of a coherent worldview in which America served as a template. So Immigration Act of 1924, really they're trying to say, here's the immigrants we want, here's what we don't want. And mostly it was dealing with Southern and Eastern Europe, saying they don't want, there weren't a lot coming in from other places, but then just completely all non-Europeans. And it kind of looks like that way today with even refugees. The government right now is limiting refugees from anywhere, but really encouraging white refugees from South Africa. It's like, ooh, white South Africans, come, you can go through the process quickly. Others, kind of full. There's probably reasons for that, all that, but those kind of decisions can influence others to say, hey, this country's doing that, we can do it, but we can always take it another step. So some have seen the parallels today, where white South Africans have priority over others who've been waiting in the system much longer. So in June 1934, before the Nuremberg Laws were even drafted, a group of top Nazi legal minds gathered to study how to legally construct a racial state. Their goal was to reduce Jews in Germany to second-class citizens, strip them of civil rights, and forbid intermarriage with so-called Aryans. So as they looked for legal models, they studied U.S. race law more closely than any other legal system. That's because nowhere else in the world had race been encoded into law with such complexity and inventiveness. Say what you want about the Americans, they're pretty good at creating legal systems that can oppress different groups of people. It's a long-standing tradition in this country. A key participant in that meeting called U.S. law, quote, the most useful material for the Nazi project. The Nazis admired how thoroughly the U.S. had embedded white supremacy into both statute and custom, from voting rights to immigration law to marriage. So, in this book, Hitler's American Model, Whitman explores how Nazi lawyers and lawmakers studied these American legal precedents, especially those related to race, in their development of Germany's own racial laws. Far from being fringe views, admiration for the United States as a racial model was widespread in early Nazi Germany. So a Nazi historian in 1934 called the founding of the U.S. the most important event in the history of the states of the second millennium, saying it advanced Aryan global dominance. Another writer in 1936 argued that the U.S. world leadership enabled the conscious unity of the white race. So whether America intended it or not, people around the world saw this is a country focused for white people and the white race. In the U.S., we try to downplay that now, like, oh, we rights and equal. It was built into the legal system for a long time, so much so that people in other countries could look at the U.S. and see it as a nation built on white supremacy. We can try to whitewash that history, like, oh, that wasn't the case. But when other people outside are pointing to that, whether you meant it or not, that's the perception. So in Nazi circles, U.S. legal segregation was not seen just as legitimate, but exemplary. Influential American eugenicists like Madison Grant and Lothrop Stoddard were widely read and respected in Germany. A Nazi magazine once praised lynching as a form of natural resistance. And of course, the U.S. has a massive history of lynching. As part of our civil rights tour coming up in March, we're going to go to the Peace and Justice Memorial that kind of memorializes all the victims of racial lynching in the U.S. The Ku Klux Klan, too, was compared favorably to Nazi paramilitary groups like the Brown Shirts. The racial caste system of the American South seemed eerily similar to what the Nazis envisioned for Germany. So Jim Crow and precedents. So what did the Nazis actually see in American law? Because they thought it was great, thought it was a model. What key things did they see? The first is second-class citizenship. The Nazis took a note of how African Americans, especially in the South, but over the whole country, had been systematically stripped of meaningful citizenship, denied voting rights, excluded from juries, and subjected to segregated schools and facilities. Then territorial rule in colonial subjects. They also saw how Puerto Ricans, Filipinos, and Native Americans were legally subordinated, often in territories acquired through conquest, kind of like ghettos. Nazi legal theory viewed this as a model for dealing with what they saw as foreign populations inside the German state. So eventually they create ghettos for groups, right? They see this and how America treats these groups, and they kind of, from the outside, like, looks like you don't really think of Native Americans as Americans. You put them in their own little area so they don't intermingle. Or you have the things like the Indian schools, like in Carlisle, trying to make them become more white and assimilated into the culture. Anti-miscegenation laws. Perhaps most striking was their admiration for American laws banning interracial marriage. At the time, 30 out of 48 U.S. states had anti-miscegenation statutes, often with criminal penalties. These laws did not just affect black-white relationships, they also targeted Asian Americans and Native Americans. Some U.S. states even employed the one-drop rule, where a single drop of non-white ancestry legally categorized someone as non-white. Radical Nazi thinkers wanted to implement a similar idea in Germany, but were surprised to find the American system even harsher than what they proposed. There's even a quote that said, hey, America goes a bit too far on this. To let that sink in, many of the Nazi legal theorists thought the U.S. went too far on their racial laws. Nazis, U.S., too far. So segregation and state control. The Nazis also closely examined American segregation, especially in the Jim Crow South, but interestingly, they did not fully replicate this system in Germany. Some radical Nazis wanted to implement full segregation between Jews and Aryans. More moderate Nazis thought this was impractical, especially in private spaces, and argued that criminalizing Jewish-German interaction would be more efficient. So they debated amongst themselves, we want to have a complete segregation, kind of like Jim Crow South, different water fountains, different restaurants, different spots on the bus for Jews. They eventually decided, let's just criminalize the interaction, therefore we don't have to make these separate spaces. We'll just basically force them not to have this through legal means. The Nazis also rejected lynching, not out of moral concern, but because they believed the racial violence should be centralized and monopolized by the state, less so by these different mobs. So they put it more in the hands of the SS. They deplored American mob justice, not because it was unjust, but because it was disorderly. Remember, we're talking about Germans here. They like a nice orderly system of things. So they wanted this kind of state-sponsored violence to be state-sponsored. Let's have our different groups. Whether it's immigration control, whether it's the SS, whether it's the Browns, just have our people enact this violence. Therefore, we don't have the kind of chaos of mob rule. Now, of course, it happened in Nazi Germany. There were sometimes mobs getting out of control. Think of Kristallnacht, Night of Shattered Glass. A lot of these things did eventually get really big. But in this way, the Nazi regime positioned itself as more orderly than the U.S., even as it pursued equally, if not more, violent objectives. So other key aspects. Whitman makes a crucial distinction. Nazis were less interested in Jim Crow segregation laws and more focused on broader federal legal structures that entrenched racial hierarchy. These included immigration and naturalization law, such as the 1790 Naturalization Act, which restricted citizenship to free white persons. Indian law, which treated Native Americans as wards rather than full citizens. So all this is things that happened in the U.S. 1790 Naturalization Act, only citizens could be free white persons. Indian law, Native Americans weren't full citizens, they were wards of the state. Basically, the government is saying, you aren't capable of governing yourself or fully participating in our government, we have to take care of you. Again, it's a, we are superior, you are less superior. Even Woodrow Wilson, we talked about last week, thought only like white Anglo-Saxon Protestants could really self-govern themselves. Then there were the interracial marriage bans, which existed in 30 states, including many outside the South. In many ways, U.S. law offered what Nazi jurists craved, a flexible legal toolkit for classifying people by race and limiting their rights accordingly. The U.S. allowed judges wide discretion and relied on vague definitions of racial categories, tools that Nazis adopted for their own use. Paradoxically, some Nazis found American laws too extreme. For instance, the infamous one-drop rule, which classified anyone with even one black ancestor as black, was rejected by some Nazi legal theorists as unscientific and overly harsh. They wanted racial classification laws that appeared more rational, even if the outcomes were just as exclusionary. So, one key figure who helped transmit American race law into Nazi discourse was Heinrich Krieger. He was a German legal scholar who studied U.S. race law at the University of Arkansas in 1933 and 34. He authored a book titled Race Law in the United States, which became an influential text among Nazi lawmakers. Krieger was particularly taken with American founders like Jefferson and Lincoln, citing their belief in the resettlement or separation of races. Krieger interpreted their actions and beliefs as precursors to what the Nazis themselves aimed to do: force Jews out of Germany through systematic exclusion and pressure. He even suggested that had Lincoln not been assassinated, he might have implemented something akin to ethnic cleansing, drawing a disturbing parallel between American history and Nazi policy. Now, when we think of Lincoln, we think of the great emancipator. But here's a Nazi theorist who studied Lincoln, some of his laws and everything, saying, hey, I actually think Lincoln might have gone a similar route to the Nazis in an ethnic cleansing of different groups in the U.S. Now, we can't play conditional history. I'm not going to say anything about that, but somebody in Germany studying all this were inspired by both people like Jefferson and people like Lincoln, who we uphold as these great virtues of what Jefferson really didn't want to have slaves. Jefferson wrote the Declaration. We focus on that. This Krieger found stuff in them that said, hey, these people are models for what we want to do in Nazi Germany. So it's kind of two people we uphold as the great of democracy. They're saying, hey, great for white democracy. There's something there. So,
Can I just chime in? It's interesting. I'm just reading a book now called Lincoln's Last Speech. But Lincoln actually, at the end of the Civil War, when they were, free America, free the slaves, but on the Reconstruction aspect, he initially said that he was going to allow the southern states to maintain their laws that dealt with slavery. He was going back and forth, and then as the time went around, he did come around to say, no, if you want to back into the Union, you're going to have to totally abolish slavery. So initially, there was some speeches that he made that indicated that he was going to allow the southern states to do what they want, but it was kind of wishy-washy. Thaddeus Stevens actually was pushing him very, very hard the other way, and up to the other anti-slavery folks. So there is some questions. Lincoln initially came around and still found, but initially there was a little bit of you could infer some of his early writings on that.
yeah, and it's hard to know what people do. Is it because of a belief, or is it because of political pragmatism or realism of, we want them back in, we're going to let them do their own thing for a while, even though they don't really like it. We never know how Lincoln would have addressed Reconstruction because he was assassinated. The things about Lincoln, his initial aim, of course, wasn't to free the slaves. That wasn't an aim of the North till much later. There were some abolitionists early on who were keyed in on, but they were often seen as troublemakers and annoying. So it took a while. That's a whole other class on Lincoln and the Civil War. But yeah, there's stuff in the U.S. that inspires. We're going to look at the blueprint for these Nuremberg Laws. So the heart of Whitman's argument is not about ideology alone, but legal borrowing. The Nazis did not merely admire American race law, they studied it, they debated it, and in key areas modeled their own laws on it. The most powerful evidence for this comes from a transcript of a 1934 meeting of the Nazi Commission on Criminal Law Reform. This meeting laid the groundwork for the Nuremberg Laws. These laws stripped Jews of citizenship, banned interracial between Jew and Aryans, and the Nazi jurists repeatedly referenced American law in their discussions, not just as an influence, but as a model. So we have the transcripts of this meeting. So there was a list of U.S. anti-miscegenation laws that was circulated and analyzed at this meeting. One member noted that 30 U.S. states had race-based legislation, primarily anti-miscegenation laws, which the Nazis lacked legal precedent for elsewhere. The participants debated how closely they could follow the U.S. example without violating German legal traditions. So a lot of times, countries are going to try, what can we do to limit other people's power and influence while staying kind of within the legal lane? So any administration can look at past precedents and say, well, this maybe goes against the heart, but there's a legal loophole here. There's a lot of old laws on the books in the U.S. that can allow you to do things. There are things you can do with voting rights that is technically legal, but you know who you want to limit voting opportunities for. There's all kinds of legal ways to create second-class citizens. That it's going to be perfectly fine. The Supreme Court's going to allow it because it's not going to violate the Constitution. The Supreme Court might not like the idea of it, but they might say it doesn't violate the Constitution. If you went a little bit further, it might. But you can go up to these points. So there's all these kind of voting rights laws, other things that groups know what they're trying to do. They're trying to limit, whether it's Democrat or Republican, different administrations, different parties can work on laws to effectively take power from certain groups. We've seen the gerrymandering. If you can put all one group of people in with a much bigger other group, you can effectively nullify their votes. and we see that in red states, blue states, let's take away this group's voting bloc by watering it down so much with people who are going to vote the other way, they effectively have no real voice. Perfectly legal, happening in states, but you can do it that way. Also, while many countries disapproved of interracial marriage, few had laws banning it. The U.S. stood alone in that regard, providing the rare legal model. Nazis found U.S. state-level marriage laws, especially those that criminalized black-white relations, particularly useful. While they did not copy these laws verbatim, they took note of their structure and enforcement mechanisms. In fact, radical Nazi lawmakers used American race law as justification for pushing Germany's own legislation further. More moderate Nazis hesitated, referring propaganda to strict legal codes. But the radicals prevailed, using America's example to argue that legal racial segregation and exclusion could be systematized through law. What's again remarkable is that the more moderate Nazis thought this was too extreme, that the American race law went too far. So, implications and reckoning with legal legacy. What does all this mean for how we understand American history? Whitman's conclusion is sobering. The United States served as the world's leading example of race-based legal governments in the early 20th century. Eventually, they probably get replaced by places like South Africa, who had these strict kind of apartheid laws. Nazi Germany studied that model and adapted it to its own genocidal ends. This does not mean the U.S. is responsible for the Holocaust, but it does mean that American legal structures helped shape a climate in which exclusion and dehumanization became legally and socially acceptable. The U.S. has a long history of legally and culturally dehumanizing certain groups. So these people aren't really important. This goes way back even to a class we had back in 2024 on, I'm forgetting the phrase now, this kind of doctrine of discovery from the Catholic Church that was used in the U.S. to say, we can go and take over places, because really these people living in these islands or the places, well, they're savages, and it would really be best if we took them over and taught them to know Jesus, because isn't that the Christian thing to do? And if they don't know Jesus, well, the best thing would be just to kill them and just make it better for everybody, because they are lesser than us. This is old school doctrine of discovery stuff, comes out of the Vatican, way before even our manifest destiny idea, but the doctrine of discovery is actually kind of used in Supreme Court cases in the U.S. as part of that expansion to say, it's okay if we expand, take over these colonies, because they can't really govern themselves. We can bring them democracy. And they can be second-class citizens, because second-class citizens here would be better than the life they're living now. So, U.S. has a history of being able to dehumanize groups and say, these people don't matter as much. It goes way back to Europe and all this larger colonialization. There's several books in our library about the doctrine of discovery. All of these things build on each other. Again, American race laws didn't just come out of the crazy ideas of early Americans. They got these things from other places too. History always builds upon itself. So let's be clear, Nazi Germany did not need the United States to invent racism or anti-Semitism, but the legitimizing effect of seeing similar laws in the U.S. mattered deeply to Nazi thinkers. They saw the rise of anti-Semitism in the U.S. during this American Midnight period we talked about last week. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 20th century, not just focused on black people, but on Jews, on Catholics, on other cultures. They saw how that was used. They saw more of these kind of ways that the state kind of even made Jewish people second-class citizens. And they're like, okay, we're not out on a limb here. This is very doable. So other scholars like Cliff Stratton echo this view. They argue that racism is not a historical accident or regional problem. It is embedded in American institutions from the Constitution onward. Even today, the legal mechanisms created to enforce racial hierarchies, voter suppression laws, redlining, unequal sentencing persist in various forms. Back in 2020, I guess, during all the George Floyd protests, we had kind of a system of reading to understand more of this. We had this kind of like 30 days of justice, trying to learn more about redlining. What is redlining? What are different ways that white supremacy has been embedded in? We looked at the documentary 13, which kind of looks at how the difference between crack and cocaine and the sentences differ for crack and cocaine. Crack is a less potent form of the same drug that had higher sentences because more black users use crack while more rich white people use cocaine. So cocaine, much more potent, refined, lesser sentences than crack, which is more of the street drug. If you look at how they arrested, you can easily find rich people in the 80s and things using cocaine in a New York high-rise, but police didn't go there. They focused in on black neighborhoods. And you can read the notes how this was a focused idea from these political parties to focus on black crime more than white crime. So not everything has to be legally codified. It's in practice. You can say, hey, we're going to go after all the criminals who do this, but you can tell your police force, go to this neighborhood, go get the rich white people if you want to, or go get the poor white people, go to Chinatown, whatever, because you can send your resources where you want. So how the laws are overseen and implemented also makes a difference. Because you can turn a blind eye to this group and really go in after this group. But even in the U.S., post-World War II, we had a lot of laws and sentencing requirements that were racially not equitable. And before that, while the Nazis were looking at it, in that American Midnight period we talked about last week, the same thing was happening. So by tracing these roots, Whitman forces us to confront the deeper architecture of American law and the ways it has been used to police identity and exclude the other. So America has a long history of that. Now, that is not to say America is the only country that did that. It's not to say America was founded on pure evil. I mean, you can go to any country and look, there's some pretty evil stuff. Britain's got some pretty dark skeletons in their closet. The Netherlands got some really dark skeletons in their closet. The U.S. does as well. We all do. The key is you need to shine a light on those dark places, but also lift up the good stuff. Because while America, in this experiment of democracy, had some pretty bad things, it was also the somewhat normal of the time. And so they may have taken a step forward. We can't expect groups of people to take 25 steps forward beyond the current culture. I talked about this on a Sunday not long ago. Like the whole idea of an eye for an eye at the time of the Old Testament was kind of a progressive step forward in equitable justice. We look at it now and think it's barbaric. Later comes, turn the other cheek, but you can go so far. So we can't expect these early founders to have suddenly made this complete equal utopia. This wasn't kind of possible at that time. They took steps forward. So we need to celebrate the brilliance that is the Declaration, the brilliance that is the Constitution, while also recognizing it's not perfect. It's not the end-all, be-all. There are still things that needed to be improved upon. And we've done that to some extent in some different amendments that have been added to the Constitution, different laws, different practices. In some ways, we've gone beyond what the Constitution Declaration said as far as freedom and democracy. And in other areas, we haven't fully lived up to what is tried to provide as well. So with all of history, in every nation, every community, you have to recognize the bad, recognize where you've fallen short, name it, look at how it can improve, but also recognize where we've done really well. Where are the giant strides forward? The problem is when we try to make history all one or the other, to sugarcoat it or to make it seem, oh, we're so bad, there's nothing redeemable, both aren't good ways of doing history. You've got to hold all these things in tension, understand the context, shine a light where it needs to be shined, but also lift up where it needs to be lifted up. So, conclusions. This history is deeply uncomfortable, especially for Americans who are justly proud of the civil rights movements that dismantled Jim Crow and all that. One aspect of the civil rights movement that has always impressed me is how many liberation movements around the world have been inspired by it. So yeah, we inspired the Nazis, but we've also inspired other things. We shouldn't forget that. Last spring, I attended a book talk with the former mayor of Derry, Londonderry, and Forrest Isaac Jones, the author of the book Good Trouble, the Selma, Alabama, and Derry, Northern Ireland Connection. We have a copy in our library. He shared how much Catholics drew on the American civil rights movement, not just for inspiration, but as a model to follow in Northern Ireland. This is also a truth to remember. We've inspired some bad stuff. We've inspired some good stuff. But we also must confront this truth. The very system that Black Americans and their allies struggled to destroy also served as a model for one of the most evil regimes in history. We often think of the United States as a beacon of democracy, but to the Nazis we were also a pioneer of racial law. Both can be true. And in a world where white nationalism and authoritarian ideologies are once again on the rise, this history urgently matters. To study the Nuremberg Laws without studying Jim Crow is to miss the transatlantic roots of modern racialized statecraft. And to ignore this history is to deny ourselves the chance to fully reckon with how law has been used not just to protect freedom, but to entrench racial hierarchy. So let me close with a line from Whitman that I think captures the core message of everything we've talked about today. He writes, "The image of America as seen through Nazi eyes in the early 1930s is not the image we cherish, but it is hardly unrecognizable." We can recognize it then. We can recognize a lot of those same fingerprints today if you take the time to look. Understanding this history is not about self-flagellation, it's about responsibility. Legal systems don't just reflect values, they shape them. The story of how American law influenced Nazi Germany should serve as a profound warning. What we codify into law matters, not just here, but globally. So we need to think about how the laws and how we implement the laws not just reflect the values we hold as a people, but how they may shape the values of the coming generations in this country, but also around the world. Questions, comments, other stuff? Bill?
This reminds me of reading the Bible and all the problems people had learning, different groups had living together. We still have it.
Yep.
The few groups in power want to set the rules to protect their power as long as they can control it. And it's a matter of people learning to live with people and people that are different than them.
Yeah. And we still struggle with the same basic thing of love your neighbor, right?
Yes.
I mean, we haven't mastered that yet. And you can see it in the Bible of like, victims become perpetrators, who make more victims, who make more perpetrators.
Vicious cycle, isn't
Yeah.
it?
You can look at the history of Israel and see a lot of bad stuff there. And you can see the roots of some of the stuff they do today, often based on the things that have happened to them too. Mike?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. When there were wars in the Middle East and in Israel, the winner would kill all men and boys, and I guess procreate with the women left after that. And it's kind of a refinement of that human nature, of the way we have dealt with different groups that we were in competition with and were at war with throughout history, and except a more subtle way through immigration and miscegenation laws.
So, like when Israel took the Promised Land, we don't have a lot of historical information for that. We just have the texts in the Bible, which are going to be slightly slanted one way, right? But in general, the idea they, pretty much took it over, killed everyone. A lot of historians think they kind of also assimilated in, killed all the men and women, men and children, assimilated the women in, and created them as part of the new culture. Then later, Babylon comes, takes Israel, moves them out. A lot of the Jewish people end up getting married, having kids with Babylonians. That creates a different group of people that then aren't liked by the pure Jews. That's where the whole kind of Samaria Jewish thing, why Jews and Samaritans don't get along, it goes back to that time period. So you have all, and then after the Babylonian captivity, you have this kind of bad time in Israel where they're trying to figure out who they are as a people now. They rediscover the Torah, they lean really heavily into that law, and they start kicking out people who have kind of intermarried out of necessity at the time. Foreign women are like kicked out, their hair's pulled out, and this is all done by the state because they're trying to be holy again because all these bad things happen, so you want to shift the pendulum to the way far side. Let's be really legalistic, follow these old laws we found to get ourselves an identity back. And what you see happening in the statecraft world of Israel in the Bible is stuff you can see in the 20th century and 19th century in global politics. That's why I love the Bible, not because it's this perfect book that God dictates, because it's a book from the human perspectives trying to figure out what it means to know God, to follow God, and it's so real because every day you can find things in it that are happening in the world around us. People are like, oh, did you write this sermon based on what's happening in the world today? Like, no, I wrote it 3 years ago. But what's happening in the Bible is always happening in the world today. It's not hard to find a text that matches with some thing in the world because the Bible is life. It's history. It's people. And people fundamentally are people. We're going to talk about it today with Reinhold Niebuhr that people can do great things and horrible things. And you got to hold those two things in tension all the time. You see it in the Bible, you see it in laws, you see it in nations and empires and wars. In Nazi Germany, you can see the height of the goodness of people who tried to help others. And you can see the depths of the depravity of people. You can see it in the U.S. today. All the time, we can see the heights of just the godlike image in people and love, and you can see the depths of sin. And Christian realism looks and holds both of those things as true. We are created in the image of God. We can love. We can do good things, but also we're never pure, and sin's going to have its effects. Other questions and comments? Rick?
Was there any mention in his writings about the women's suffrage situation? Because that was happening at the same time during, what was the amendment that allowed women? 2020? Yeah. So was there any, in his writings, did he use that as, the Nazis use that for anything,
Not really, because they didn't want more rights for people. It's interesting. And I haven't done any research into this at all. But the women's suffrage movement, you had these women kind of standing up saying, "Hey, we want this. We're protesting," and that's been a model for other places around the world too. There is a story from Nazi Germany. There's a monument there to this kind of women's protest when a bunch of women's husbands were kind of taken by the Nazis, mostly Jewish women. Without a lot of explanation, the women are like, "Nope, not doing that, people." And they gathered and kind of stood around this government building and just kept going day after day. And finally, they were like, "We're tired of these women being here and making a scene." They ended up giving their husbands back. So maybe they learned that from the U.S. movement. I don't know. I think evil begets evil, and you see it influenced. But love and justice also beget love and justice. So often throughout the world, there are two streams happening at once. In the civil rights movement, you had examples of how other nations can create unjust systems for people, and at the same time, you can inspire nations and groups to try to create better rights. Both those things are happening at the same time in the 60s. But nothing particular he wrote really focused on it. Any other questions? All right, this might.
Have you seen the book, or is the book available by Heinrich Krieger?
I don't know. I have not jumped into trying to read that one yet.
Or if it's German or
It's probably available somewhere. I bet it's probably available in Germany. It's kind of like, I don't know for sure. Depending, I don't know about Germany. It's like we want to kind of suppress these things or not. I imagine they wouldn't. They want to like, these are the things that existed and happened. You'd probably find it from a specialist press somewhere in Germany. I don't know. It's kind of like, you know, here, for the most part, we don't want to ban books. There's a book, I forget the name of it. Greg Robertson was looking at reading it, and I said, after you read it, I'll read it. But it's even been banned on Amazon, but it kind of paints a picture of how the U.S. can go back to a racially pure white people country. It's kind of fictionalized, but blueprint kind of how to do that. And it's been very heavily used by far-right groups in the U.S. And you can even see it starting to play out in some of the laws that are happening now. So it's been banned in a lot of places. It's pretty extreme. You can't get it on Amazon, but you can find it some places. Not the kind of person like, I'll read anything because I want to know what the thought processes are out there. So I'd be interested in the Krieger book and reading more about it. But no, I have not read it or know where to get it. Alrighty, thank you.
When was it that we were a pure white country?
Depends on who you ask.
That boggles my mind to even think of.
It's often people create, especially like we talked about last week with strawman leaders, they create a nostalgia for something that never quite existed, but exists in our mind. Like we all have these times, there's an old song by Rascal Flatts. I miss Mayberry sitting on the front porch drinking ice cold cherry Coke. And then they did, everything was perfect back then. Was it? They talk about where everything was black and white, easy to know. Like, yeah, everything was black and white back then, especially the lunch counters. We create these Leave It to Beaver things. There's a book my wife's read called The Way We Never Were that kind of looks at this idea of historical memory. So I think we can look and say, well, we never were a completely pure white country now, because even early on, the idea of whiteness isn't the same as the idea of whiteness today. Race and the racial constructs have changed over time. People can look back and say, but there was a time when white people had all the power or something like that. But even that can be kind of questioned. Because again, we use different terms. The way we use the term white and race today is different than the way they used the term white and race in the 18th century, if they use it at all for the most part. So you have to be careful on that line of thinking too. If you have real questions about that, ask my wife, who knows a whole lot more about that, because 18th century is her area of expertise. Alrighty, thank you all very much. Have a good one.
I mean,